So, hi guys, and today we're going to be talking about the classical bishop sacrifice, or the so-called Greek gift. It's named the Greek gift because if you take it, then you are in a lot of trouble. So in this case, the classical bishop sacrifice involves a capture either on h7 or, in the case of black, on h2. And this move breaks the enemy king's defenses and allows white to launch a very fast attack. Here we have one of the most common examples of a classical bishop sacrifice. White captures on h7, check. Notice, by the way, very often when these sacrifices work, it's when the enemy king has very little piece protection. Notice how all the queenside all the minor pieces are on the queen side. So after bishop takes h7, check, here king takes h7, drawing the king out, white continues with knight to g5, check. Now, if the king were to go to g6, it would simply be too exposed. There would be moves like queen to g4, with devastating threats like knight takes e6 check, and there would also be moves like queen d3 check. For this reason, the best defense is to go back to g8. But now comes the queen to h5. And here we see the threat against the f7 point, which is always very weak, and also the threat of queen h7. Black can only defend against one of these threats. He can go queen to d7. Protecting f7, this is his best bet. But after queen h7 check, the king runs to f8, queen h8 check. Notice, by the way, in this position, why queen d7 made a lot of sense rather than going queen e7, because if you had placed your queen on e7 to defend this point, it would already be checkmate. But even in this position, as black flees the king side, white gets a second pawn and creates a threat of capturing on f7. Black can try to defend f7 via a move like rook to f8, but here white would go knight h7, striking at the rook and also threatening to bring the bishop in. The black position has crumbled, and white, who gave up a piece, has already got 2 pawns for it, so the material is not even so great. So this is an example of a very typical way of conducting the classical bishop sacrifice, and it's a very powerful sacrifice. It's usually a game-ending sacrifice if you get it right. So now what we're going to show is we're going to show 2 more examples of bishop sacrifices that are a little bit more complicated than this, but that are very, very important to know. The next one, and in fact the final one, will all involve not just a single bishop sacrifice, but a double bishop sacrifice. It's very common that it'll be a great idea to sacrifice not just one bishop, but in fact the second one. So we're about to take a look at that now. In the first example, we saw a classical bishop sacrifice in its most normal, most conventional form. Bishop takes h7, then a knight jumps into g5, and the knight assists the queen. However, sometimes you'll get a different type of position where h7 is very well protected, in this case by a knight on f6. And so the typical idea is not available to white. And here it's very important to be aware of another concept, which is the double bishop sacrifice. Now, the first thing that white needs to do is try to get rid of this defensive piece. So white plays the move knight to h5. Knight to h5, challenging this knight. And here black makes a mistake. Black captured this knight, probably expecting that white would recapture with the queen. And here there would be a threat of mate, but black could stop it with either pawn to g6 or pawn to f5. However, white had different intentions. He plays the intermezzo, the in-between classical bishop sacrifice. He takes on h7. Now, after king takes h7, only then does he capture the knight on h5. The next move is forced by black. He goes king to g8. And here, well, if we are white, we know from our first pattern that if we could just have a knight and plant it on g5, then we could threaten the same ideas as before, the same checkmate, and this would be winning. However, because we don't have the knight, we need to go a different route. And here is the double bishop sacrifice. White has this bishop remaining, and so he captures the pawn on g7. The threat is queen h8 checkmate. And so black feels compelled to capture this bishop. But now, what white does is he plays queen to g4 check. Black has to choose. Does he go onto the h file or does he step onto the f file? If he steps onto the f file, it's checkmate in 1. Can you see it? Queen g5 is mate. So therefore, black has to pick a square, any one of these, and pretty much no matter where black goes, white's idea connected almost always, the double bishop sacrifice will be connected with the rook lift. So white's follow-up here is rook lift to the f3 square. The king has been opened up along both the h file and the g file, and now the threat is rook h3 with mate, and black has no good move. This pattern has been seen time and time again in chess, and so it's a really, really important one to know. So far you've seen the first pattern, which is the very conventional bishop takes h7 followed by knight g5 check. Now you know the second pattern, which is the double bishop sacrifice with a rook lift. And finally, the third example that we want to show you is the double bishop sacrifice, but not on g7 or on g2, but on a different square entirely. So let's check that out as our final example. In this final example, we will really see the importance of not just having knowledge of the typical double bishop sacrifice, but of this second double bishop sacrifice. Because here, this game was taken, this position was taken from a game played in the 19th century. And black, he saw the classical bishop sacrifice, he took on h2, and white captured the bishop on h2. He had not much choice. And now, queen h4 check. By now you should be familiar with these ideas. And white had no other move but king g1. Here, black played the conventional double bishop sacrifice and he took on g2. His hope was that after king takes g2, he would get the same type of checkmate that we saw in the previous line. Queen g4 check drives the king over to the h file, and wherever he goes, rook f6, that rook lift, brings the rook to h6. However, there was a problem. In this position, white stayed alive with the move pawn to f4. Now, black would love to quarrel the white king with the move queen g3 and create some mating threats. Specifically, any retreat of the bishop here would create checkmating threat. But the problem is the white queen is able to capture this bishop, and then white is actually the one who wins. So black needs to do something different. And in this position, he had one winning move. Feel free to pause the video and try and find the winning move. So, it's a bishop sacrifice, but not on g2. It's a bishop sacrifice on f3. If you were white, the equivalent would be the bishop sacrifice on f6. The idea here is still the same. If you capture on f3, the rook lift will cause checkmate not along the h file, but along the g file. In other words, white's king is exposed along h and g file. However, the importance of this move is that black not only is threatening after g takes to play like this, or if white does nothing, he has this option of lifting the rook, but he also adds another threat, which is the move queen to g4. As a result, white needs to do something here and needs to do something quite fast. Now, a natural move is bishop e2. But here, and only here, black captures on g2. The difference is that after king takes g2, the same mate will apply, queen g5 followed by the rook lift. If king f3, queen g4 is mate. And if, on the other hand, white tries the same strategy as before, which is f4, the fact that white played bishop e2 means that the queen is no longer attacking the bishop. Now queen g3 is an option, and in fact it's a winning move, because white, no matter what he does, the threats are simply too many. Bishop h3 is a threat of mate, bishop f3 comes with immediate mate, bishop e4 comes with checkmate, or in cases where it's not mate, the queen would be attacked and would fall. So there are simply too many threats. That first step onto the f3 square makes all the difference here. So that is a very, very important motif to know. So in closing, you have three classical bishop sacrifices themes that you should be aware of. The first is the very standard one where the bishop is sacrificed either on h7 or h2 and the knight hops in to assist the queen. The second is the double bishop sacrifice with an eventual rook lift and checkmate between queen and rook. And the final one is this twist on the double bishop sacrifice where the bishop first steps onto either f3 or f6. So with all of that, I hope you're much better prepared to both meet the classical bishop sacrifice and prevent it when it works, and to ensnare your opponents in a classical bishop sacrifice trap if they are not careful. So hope you enjoyed this video, and see you in the next video.